Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to break down the absolutely astonishing 160-year economic speed run of Japan. I mean, we're looking at a complete ground-up transformation here. They went from an isolated medieval society to a massive global empire, went right through total devastation, built themselves into a high-tech powerhouse, and finally, well, turned into a modern cautionary tale of economic stagnation. It's a wild ride for sure. And honestly, understanding exactly how they pulled this off gives us an incredible lens into how our own global economy works today. Let's get right into it.
Here's our roadmap for the explainer. We're going to cover the end of isolation, modernizing to survive, empire, war, and ruin, the post-war miracle, education and hyper-efficiency, and finally wrap it up with the decades of stagnation. Kicking things off with Section 1, the end of isolation and the arrival of the black ships.
So, back during the Tokugawa period, Japan was incredibly isolated from the rest of the world. Citizens literally couldn't leave, foreigners were mostly banned, and trade was severely restricted. What did this mean in practice? Well, by the 1860s, Japan was essentially still a medieval society. We're talking wooden houses, ruled by daimyo lords, and protected by samurai knights. But meanwhile, across the globe, in places like London and New York, the West was fully industrializing with massive factories, steamboats, and sprawling railroads. And this massive technological gap became an immediate, frankly terrifying problem for Japan in the 1850s. Heavily armed, steam-powered battleships from the US and then later from Russia and Britain just suddenly appeared on Japan's shores. And the crazy part, Japan's cannons literally couldn't even reach these foreign ships. It was no contest. They were forced into signing 11 humiliating treaties just to avoid having their wooden capitals burned to the ground. But we really have to ask ourselves a crucial question here. Why on earth did these modern global powers suddenly care so much about an isolated pre-industrial island nation?
Well, it all came down to a fascinating chain reaction. You see, steamships had just been invented, right? But they burned through coal incredibly fast. Usually in about 2 weeks, they'd be completely out. At the exact same time, China had just lost the Opium Wars, and its massive, highly lucrative market was forced wide open. So to actually get to China across the vast Pacific Ocean, these Western powers desperately needed a refueling pit stop. And guess what? Japan happened to be sitting right on that route, absolutely packed with abundant coal. So the reality is, foreign powers didn't actually care about Japan itself. They just needed to use Japanese coal to make those trade routes to China far more profitable.
Moving into Section 2, modernizing to survive. How the state acted as a venture capitalist. The Japanese government quickly realized that their lack of industry wasn't just a minor weakness, it was an absolute existential threat. They saw exactly what was happening to other nations around the world that were being beaten and colonized, and this realization led to a massive radical overthrow of their own leadership in 1868, a political shift known as the Meiji Restoration. Basically, to avoid becoming a colonized territory themselves, Japan executed what was essentially the very first self-guided economic development plan in history. They decided, flat out, that the only way to beat the West was to aggressively copy their institutions and technology. But think about it. How do you actually industrialize when your citizens can't afford expensive modern machinery? Well, the government stepped right in as a massive venture capitalist. They took out domestic loans, and crucially, they kept that debt strictly within Japan. They went ahead and hired Western experts, like bringing US agriculture advisors all the way out to the island of Hokkaido. They actively funded smart, ambitious entrepreneurs, set up competing companies to drive efficiency, and incubated them until they were turning a profit. Seriously, major legacy brands you know today, like Toshiba, Sapporo Beer, and Mitsubishi, they all trace their massive growth straight back to this exact era of government-backed incubation. And the kicker, once these companies were profitable, the state simply handed them over to private enterprise, a real game changer.
Which brings us to Section 3. Empire, war, and ruin, the devastating price of expansion.
It worked so well that by 1894, Japan's modernization had succeeded wildly. So wildly, in fact, that Great Britain, who was the world's reigning superpower at the time, actually signed a new treaty with Japan as a total equal. But being recognized as a great power back then basically meant you had to join the global trend of imperialism. To feed their exploding modern economy, Japan desperately needed resources, and this triggered a rapid and incredibly aggressive expansion. Over just a few decades, they colonized the Ryukyu Kingdom, Taiwan, South Sakhalin, Korea, and Manchuria. They used these new territories as both a defensive shield and a vital source of raw materials for the mainland.
Now, we absolutely must objectively note the dark reality of this era. While everyday life drastically improved and modernized for Japanese citizens prior to the 1940s, making them incredibly wealthy, we have to remember that this wealth was built on brutal colonial abuse. We're talking horrific massacres and widespread slave labor. This aggressive imperial expansion ultimately culminated in direct conflict with the Allies in World War II, a war that Japan decisively lost, leaving millions of its people homeless and its cities reduced to firebombed ruins.
Let's look at Section 4, the post-war miracle and pivoting in the Cold War. So, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, the US occupied a completely broken Japan, and their initial intent was clear: keep the country weak and demilitarized. But global geopolitics can change in a flash. With communism rapidly rising in nearby Korea and China, the US suddenly realized they desperately needed a strong capitalist ally in the East. Their solution? The US agreed to station their own troops in Japan for defense, but they required Japan to pay 75% of the cost to host them. Now, I know that sounds like a massive penalty, but actually, it was an incredibly advantageous deal for Japan. It provided them with a highly advanced, remarkably cheap defense force, and without a massive military to fund, it freed up almost their entire national budget to focus strictly on economic development. Completely stripped of their former colonies, Japan had to pivot. They turned entirely to trade, utilizing an economic policy known as comparative advantage. Basically, instead of trying to build everything themselves from scratch, they leaned hard into their natural geography. Japan is essentially a series of mountainous coastal islands, so they just imported massive amounts of raw materials. Used their incredible coastal access to build giant industrial ports, turned those materials into heavy machinery, and then exported them right back out to the rest of the world. Section 5. Education and hyper-efficiency. Building the ultimate manufacturing engine. To actually power this new, complex, high-tech export economy, Japan knew they needed a highly skilled workforce, and they anticipated this need for mass education super early on. By the 1970s, they had heavily invested in a simplified, universal 633 education system. That's 6 years of primary, 3 of middle, and 3 of high school. The result? Over 90% high school attendance. Just compare that to the massive struggle in modern India right now, where, despite having unbelievable population potential, crumbling school infrastructure means half of 10-year-olds lack basic reading skills. Japan explicitly funded their way out of this exact trap decades ago, all so they could produce a massive generation of elite engineers and administrators.
And wow, did those engineers go to work. They started building the most densely clustered, efficient industrial zones on the entire planet. Look at this. Just in Tokyo Bay alone, Japan managed to pack 13 oil refineries right next to 14 power stations, alongside 10 shipyards. Packing all of these massive heavy industries together this tightly was absolutely brilliant. It meant that public services, energy distribution, and transportation were unbelievably cheap to maintain.
And because everything was located so incredibly close together, they were able to radically change how things were actually manufactured. Instead of having one massive factory making an entire car completely from scratch, Japan totally perfected this specialized supply chain. Picture this, hundreds of tiny factories, right? But one is dedicated entirely to engineering the absolute perfect screw, and another one is solely making the perfect gear. Assembly factories would then simply buy these hyper-specialized, perfectly crafted parts and snap them together. It maximized efficiency, completely tanked production costs, and let's be honest, it essentially became the exact blueprint for the modern global economy we all rely on today. Finally, we arrive at Section 6, the decades of stagnation, the unsolved mystery. By the 1980s, the landscape really started to shift. A newly opened China suddenly emerged, providing massive, low-cost manufacturing competition. Japan tried to pivot again, this time by selling their corporate know-how, but deeply rooted internal cultural issues were quietly compounding in the background, completely freezing their growth. And then we hit 2010. Japan's population officially peaked at 128.1 million. They literally became the very first industrialized nation on Earth to experience a shrinking and rapidly aging demographic. Now, how they culturally responded to this shrinking workforce is absolutely the crucial point here. Rather than integrating immigrant labor to replace all those retirees, Japan's strict xenophobia kept their borders mostly closed. What did that do? It forced the existing population into grueling 60-plus hour work weeks just to keep up. On top of that, there was intense systemic sexism, a very rigid glass ceiling that kept highly educated women completely out of management. Back in the 1990s, women held only 10% of management roles. By enforcing this kind of gender-based hiring and pay, Japan was deliberately depriving its own economy of top-tier talent. And the result?
Despite enjoying incredibly high living standards, the country honestly hasn't seen any real economic growth in over 30 years.
So this brings us to a really fascinating, completely unresolved mystery. Modern economics simply hasn't advanced enough yet to diagnose exactly how to restart a stagnant, aging, developed economy like this. I want to leave you with this final thought today. Having successfully engineered their way out of medieval isolation, rapidly industrialized to fight off Western powers, and completely rebuilt themselves from the absolute ashes of post-war ruin to become a global titan, how will the famously adaptive Japanese society reinvent itself next to survive this